On this episode of Charged and Disbarred.
Mark was a very successful person. For as successful as he was, he just wasn't successful enough. He needed to have more. When it came time for the government to take over the assets, F. Lee Bailey refused to turn over the stock. And this is what led to significant trouble for F. Lee Bailey.
Judges and attorneys are like kings and knights in their own realm. It is unthinkable that in a moment of madness it can all be thrown away. Charged and Disbarred explores the true life stories of attorneys who have fallen from grace. Hear firsthand accounts from the victims, detectives, and prosecutors who brought these disgraced attorneys to justice. This is Charged and Disbarred. As a great American president, Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." Or as another great man, St. Paul, said, "Each of you must examine your own actions. Then you can be proud of your own accomplishments without comparing yourself to others."
Mark Dreyer is one of the more fascinating attorneys that you'll ever hear about in the United States. Mark was a very successful person. He had the Ivy League credentials. He had Yale undergraduate, Harvard Law School. There were always great expectations for Mark, and he fulfilled those expectations. But Mark was also plagued by the fact that he was in New York City. And New York City in the 1990s and early 2000s was a place where there was just an incredible amount of wealth. He saw his peers who were wealthier than he was, and he saw his clients who were extremely wealthy. And Mark, for all of the great things he did as a lawyer, and for as successful as he was, he just wasn't successful enough. He needed to have more.
But how? That was the big question. How was he going to keep working at law firms that did not appreciate his talents? He had to make a plan, take a chance, and strike out on his own.
So in the late 1990s, Mark Dreyer decided to form his own law firm, which was named Dreyer LLP. Mark's pitch to bring in new work was to attract the best talented lawyers in the United States to come work for him. And to do that, he paid extraordinarily well. And Mark's pitch to the lawyers and the groups of lawyers who joined his firm was this: you come and work for me, I'm the sole shareholder in the firm, and you don't have to worry about management at all. You guys go out, you do your work, you bring in the clients, you bring in the business, and you're gonna get paid.
By constantly comparing himself to others, Mark Dreyer had awoken a monster of ambition that drove him to be more and more successful. However, no matter how successful he was, it was never enough. It became a bottomless pit that he was never going to fill. The truly devastating part was that he had no idea he was on a slippery slope to disaster.
Mark Dreyer had a house in the Hamptons, but it wasn't a beachfront house. Mark Dreyer had a nice place to live, but it wasn't a penthouse suite. He saw himself as someone who just wasn't successful enough. And meanwhile, he was representing some of the richest people in the world. Mark was also working around and being around other lawyers that were in his generation. And he viewed himself inferior to those individuals because they were making more money than Mark was. It was this mentality that led Mark to having an epiphany that he needed to do something crazy and dramatic to bring in a whole bunch of money into himself and as well as into his law firm.
Dreyer got to work and drew up a plan of how he was going to conquer the world. It all looked like a winning idea on paper, except it required cash. A lot of cash. His first port of call was the banks of Wall Street. However, they all turned him down. A lack of assets and credit history was his Achilles heel. He resorted to borrowing money from companies who were willing to lend against receivables, but the high interest rates charged on such loans made it impossible to sustain. He had to come up with another plan.
So Mark Dreyer's biggest client was Sheldon Solo. Sheldon Solo was a real estate tycoon in Manhattan. Mark had been representing him since the mid-1990s. and they had a very close, trustworthy relationship. Mark decided it would be a good idea to write a promissory note where the borrower of the funds was Sheldon Solo's real estate company. Now, in the early 2000s, there was lots of money flowing around New York City. Billionaire hedge fund owners couldn't find the next investment opportunity fast enough. Mark Dreyer, through his legal contacts and his business contacts, got to know some of these hedge fund managers, some of these incredibly wealthy individuals. And so Mark had an idea. I'm going to write a promissory note, making it out, pretending it to be from Sheldon Solo, and I'm going to pick a number that's a good number, good enough that it makes it worthwhile to do. So he created a fabricated $20 million promissory note purporting to be from Sheldon Solo's real estate holding company. And he also created a fake financial sheet to go along with it. So incredibly, Dreyer was able to get away with this scheme many, many times. And there was so little oversight from even the people who were investing. You know, to you and I, maybe $20 million seems like a significant investment, but for a multi-billionaire, 30-year-old hedge fund manager, a $20 million investment is like buying a cup of Starbucks. It was no big deal for them. Mark used that money and used it for two purposes. He used it to move over from the non-beachfront house in the Hamptons to buying the beachfront property in the Hamptons that he so badly wanted. He also turned a bunch of that money around and put it back into the law firm. And he was able to use the capital he was investing, stolen as it were, to invest into getting more space in his Park Avenue offices, to pay more compensation to the lawyers who work there, and to use the money to attract more groups and more lawyers to come work for him, because they were seeing this extremely successful business model that was being run by Mark Dreyer himself, and they bought into it.
The unfortunate reality for Mark Dreyer was that he had built a multi-million-dollar empire on false promissory notes. His greatest achievement was, in truth, a giant house of cards that was about to come crashing down.
No one was calling for the principal to be returned on the notes. What would happen is he would sell these notes. Typically, they would be one-year term notes. And when the 1 year was up, if the investor would want the principal and interest, of course, they could call in the note. But the investors were doing well. They were happy to have the note placed, so what they would typically do would be to just renew the note for another year. So Mark didn't have to pay back the principal or the interest on the note. That allowed him to continue to accumulate and have out on the street more and more notes. It got to the point where he had $400 million in notes. Then, around late 2007, early 2008, things are starting to get really tight on Wall Street. Suddenly, the hedge fund billionaires are not as rich as they once were. Suddenly, hedge funds are being called into question. There's much more regulation going on in the hedge fund industry. And Wall Street is slowly sinking into what would become a pretty significant downturn caused by the housing market crisis.
Mark Dreyer began as a respected lawyer turned brazen thief, but now Dreyer had become a full-blown con artist.
It all starts to come down for Mark Dreyer in November of 2008, where we have a couple of things going on at the same time. First, there is a matter of roughly $38 million in the law firm's trust account, most of which has become suddenly missing. Unbeknownst to an attorney in his firm who contacts Mark, remember, Mark now is the only person who has control of the books, and the attorney says, listen, there's supposed to be $38 million in the trust account. I need to get that money out because we need it to settle up on a particular matter. Where's the money? It's not there. And Mark says, I'll get back to you. And he realizes now he's in desperate trouble. He needs to come up with covering the money from the trust account. Where did that money go? Well, it was actually another part of Mark Dreyer's fraud. He stole the money from the trust account, lined his own pockets with that money. But now he needed to come up with $30 million fast.
At this point, it was clear that Mark Dreyer was in deep trouble. But like any liar who keeps covering their lies with even more lies, Dreyer tried to get out of his fraudulent pickle with even more fraud.
Dreyer has to come up with the money to cover the losses from the escrow account. So he devises an audacious, outrageous scheme. He wanted to sell a $100 million note to an entity called the Toronto Teachers Pension Fund in Toronto. Now, the investor who was going to be investing in this paper wanted to have a meeting at the pension fund in Toronto to check out the bona fides of the organization. So what did Mark do? Got up on his private jet, he flew up to Toronto, borrow one of the conference room offices at the pension fund, and when the people came for the meeting, he introduced himself as one of the lawyers from the pension fund. And in fact, he gave the investor a business card from the lawyer from the investment fund.
By now, this brazen maverick thought he could get away with anything.
So the Toronto meeting didn't go quite as well as Mark Dreyer had hoped. In fact, it probably couldn't have gone any worse. Investors started asking a lot of questions about people that worked at the pension fund. And it turned out that the investor knew someone else who worked at the Toronto pension fund. So Mark wasn't able to give really good answers to the investor, which was causing the investor to be quite suspicious. Mark then all of a sudden felt very skittish about what was going forward. He knew he wasn't going to get this deal done, and he decided to call the meeting short, said that his plane had to leave, and he left the offices, drove to the airport. As he was getting on his plane, his phone rang. It happened to be the chief executive of the entity called Fortress, which was an investment fund, a hedge fund, that he was trying to sell the teacher's pension fake note to. This person from Fortress called Mark and said, "What's going on there? We think that there's some identity theft or something like that going on, some impersonation at the teacher's fund."
The game was up. Mark Dreyer's house of cards had finally collapsed, and soon the rest of the world would realize it had been built with a pack of lies.
Mark Dreyer was held in jail in Toronto for several days. He was finally shipped back to the authorities in New York, and he was immediately placed under arrest. At about that same time, all of the fraud that had been ongoing at Dreyer LLP became known. The firm, within a matter of days, completely imploded. What had once been a 5-office law firm with 275 well-paid lawyers, one of the most well-respected law firms in the United States, was completely shuttered and in bankruptcy.
All that was left for Mark Dreyer was to face the consequences in court.
So Mark was charged and pleaded guilty to 8 felony counts, including conspiracy, money laundering, wire fraud, and securities fraud. In 2009, Mark was sentenced. The government wanted a 145-year sentence. Mr. Dreyer was able to get away with a 20-year prison sentence.
The simple reason why the government's prosecution team wanted such a heavy sentence for Dreyer was they wanted to send a message out to all the other lawyers in the world. If you're going to commit these types of crimes, these financial frauds, they're going to be taken very seriously. However, fortune smiled on Dreyer, as the sitting judge would have none of it. Shortly after Dreyer's fraud came to light, another even bigger fraud was uncovered, that of the now infamous Bernie Madoff. Madoff received a 150-year sentence for a $50 billion Ponzi scheme. The judge felt that Dreyer's fraud was committed mostly against multi-billionaires and was not in the same league as the Madoff case. Hence, the lighter sentence.
Mark did not dispute any of the facts alleged to the New York bar and agreed to be permanently disbarred from New York.
When Mark Dreyer graduated from high school, he was voted most likely to succeed, and succeed he did. He had an undergraduate degree from Yale and a law degree from Harvard Law School. He had worked for some of the most prestigious law firms in New York City with a 7-figure salary. Yet all of this was not enough. Mark Dreyer had compared himself to others all his life. In the little pond that was high school and university, he was on top. But in the big pond of New York City, he discovered many people and peers more successful than himself. Eventually, this compulsion for success stole his joy, and he did everything he could to get it back. Hundreds of millions of dollars stolen, and all that remains is a broken marriage, a destroyed career, and 20 years in jail. Still to come on Charged and Disbarred.
When it came time for the government to take over the assets, F. Lee Bailey refused to turn over the stock, and this is what led to significant trouble.
This is Charged and Disbarred. There is a phenomenon in psychology called bias blind spot. The theory was developed through research that involved giving people logic problems to solve. It turned out that smart people tended to make more mistakes than their average intelligence counterparts in solving these conundrums. The reason for their findings were quite simple. Smart people made more mistakes because they were overconfident. They were used to being right and gave quick answers without thinking. Also, smart people get used to being correct, so they tend to form personal identities based on being right all the time. Therefore, they find it virtually impossible to receive feedback when they're wrong. In fact, it often feels to them like a personal attack. So listening to other people's opinions is seen as a waste of time, which creates the perfect soil for blind spots to grow. A casual glance at daily news headlines tends to prove this point. One such headline came in November 2001 involving the famous defense attorney, F. Lee Bailey.
F. Lee Bailey graduated from Boston University Law School with the highest grade point average in the school's history. He was an extremely bright young lawyer, and he proved himself to be an outstanding defense lawyer. F. Lee Bailey got his big break when he represented Dr. Sam Shepard. Dr. Sam Shepard was a medical doctor who was accused of murdering his wife. F. Lee Bailey stepped in on his appeal and represented Dr. Shepard before the Supreme Court of the United States and actually won Dr. Shepard a new trial. At the new trial, F. Lee Bailey represented Dr. Shepard and had Dr. Shepard acquitted of the murder charges. His case became so famous that they developed a TV show around it, as well as a movie called The Fugitive. Over the course of the next 3 decades, F. Lee Bailey handled some of the most notorious criminal cases in U.S. history. He represented Patty Hearst, he represented the Boston Strangler, and probably his most famous cases was representing O.J. Simpson as part of this so-called Dream Team in the 1990s that won O.J. Simpson his acquittal from his murder case.
Very few people would argue the fact that F. Lee Bailey was one of the top lawyers of the 20th century. His meticulous attention to detail and the experience he gained from running a private investigation practice, in addition to being a brilliant defense lawyer, made him virtually unbeatable in the courtroom. In spite of his many successes, F. Lee Bailey's career was far from perfect. In 1970, he was censured for misconduct in Massachusetts, and in 1971, he was suspended from practicing law in New Jersey. One of his biggest misses came when he allegedly botched his closing arguments in a high-profile case involving newspaper heiress Patty Hearst. There were other incidents, but none of these events were enough to end his career, until
F. Lee Bailey's career came to an end from the representation of a drug smuggler named Claude Duboc. Now, Mr. Duboc hired F. Lee Bailey in 1994 to represent him in a drug smuggling case. Mr. Duboc was facing life imprisonment. He had a significant downside, and he needed F. Lee Bailey's legal support for his case. One of the things that Duboc had that he had hoped to trade with the government for in order to try to get a reduced sentence was assets. And in the early 1990s, one of the ways that the federal government was making money from drug cases was seizing the assets of drug smugglers. One of the hitches in Dubois' case was that most of his tangible assets were in Europe. He owned homes in France and properties in Europe that would be difficult for the US government to legally seize and then liquidate those assets. But he had one particular asset that was highly valuable. It was 600,000 shares of stock in a pharma company called Biochem Pharma. At the time of his arrest, the Biochem Pharma stock was valued at approximately $6 million. Dubois and Bailey's strategy was to use the Biochem stock as leverage in negotiating with the government to try to get a reduced sentence.
Now recall the psychological phenomenon known as bias blind spot, where smart people more often than not, despite their intelligence, are prone to make really bad decisions. F. Lee Bailey seemed to be no different.
This made Mr. Dubois actually quite happy because he saw this as being a more significant asset that he could turn to the government as an offer in trying to get a reduced sentence to have a much more liquid asset that could be sold on the open market for $20 million. And he was hoping to use this asset to buy a better sentence. The problem was that once F. Lee Bailey got the stock in his hands and had control of the stock as its trustee, he got a little greedy. What he did next was F. Lee Bailey either sold a portion of the stock or he borrowed money using the stock as collateral. As a result of his financial dealings with the stock, F. Lee Bailey netted about $4 million. He took that $4 million and used it for his own personal purposes. He bought a home with it. He put money into various businesses that he owned. When it came time for the government to take over the assets as part of the negotiated plea agreement, F. Lee Bailey refused to turn over the stock. And this is what led to significant trouble for F. Lee Bailey.
Often when children get caught with their hands in the metaphorical cookie jar, they rather fabricate a story than own up to the misdeed. Sometimes adults respond in exactly the same way, only to dig a deeper hole for themselves.
When F. Lee Bailey failed to turn over the stock, he was called before the court, and the court wanted an explanation as to what was going on with the stock and why he wasn't turning over to the government. So F. Lee Bailey's first story was that the stock was his fee and that he shouldn't have to turn over the money to the government because the stock was turned over to him as payment for his legal fees. The court did not buy that argument. F. Lee Bailey also advanced another argument, which was that even assuming that the stock wasn't all of his fee, that the appreciation of the stock in value from $6 million to $20 million, that difference, the $14 million, that F. Lee Bailey should be allowed to keep that $14 million and that the government would only get the $6 million of the original value of the stock. The court didn't buy that argument either. F. Lee Bailey refused to turn over the stock despite the court ordering him to do so. As a result of that, he went to jail for contempt of court. He remained in jail for 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, he was able to get his brother to actually raise money from whatever sources he had to pay off the government the money that was owed for the full value of the stock.
F. Lee Bailey tried to justify his actions by saying he was entitled to the stock he took because of the risk of taking the case. He just felt like he deserved to have more of the money than the federal government. He felt it would be a waste of a significant asset. On the other hand, Mr. Bailey's client saw the stock as a significant bargaining chip for him in negotiating a plea deal with the government. It was the only real asset he had to negotiate with.
F. Lee Bailey's actions raised a number of serious ethical concerns. Number one was he had a significant conflict of interest with his own client, in that he took client funds and was refusing to pay the client or to pay the government the funds for the client. So F. Lee Bailey committed one of the cardinal sins that lawyers are not supposed to commit, which is he put his own interests in front of his client's interests. And the sole apparent motivation for doing so was money. He didn't want to see what looked to be $10 to $15 million of additional money from the stock that had appreciated go into the hands of the federal government. F. Lee Bailey would prefer to have the money go into the hands of F. Lee Bailey. In addition, he had other conduct that ran afoul of some of the ethics rules that applied to him. One of the other significant problems was what was called commingling. He took client funds that were supposed to be held in trust. That was, in effect, the 600,000 shares of stock in the pharma company. He took those funds, he liquidated part of those funds, obtained $4 million from those funds, and converted that stock asset into personal funds.
Call it greed, call it overconfidence. But no matter how one looks at F. Lee Bailey's conduct, it cannot be justified in any way, shape, or form. There was only one logical outcome for his illogical behavior.
So in 2001, F. Lee Bailey not only had difficulty with the court system and his own client for how he handled the DeBach money, but the Florida bar brought him up on ethics charges for his handling of the DeBach money. In 2001, the Florida bar convicted F. Lee Bailey of violating numerous codes of professional responsibility, and F. Lee Bailey was subsequently disbarred from Florida for his unethical conduct. F. Lee Bailey was also admitted to the bar in Massachusetts, and as a result of the Florida bar's disbarment order, the Massachusetts bar also ordered the same level of discipline, that is, a disbarment. So effectively, all of the bars in which F. Lee Bailey had been a member had disbarred him, all as a result of his conduct in the mishandling of his clients' trust funds.
After a significant amount of time, one would think that humility would finally set in and F. Lee Bailey would take some sort of responsibility for his actions. Especially since he was not able to practice law and accepting responsibility would place him on the road to redemption. But alas, not in the case of F. Lee Bailey.
So F. Lee Bailey is now 80 years old, and he still wants to get back into the game of law. He's been disbarred for 15 years from the state of Florida. He's been disbarred for 13 years from the state of Massachusetts. So rather than going back to Florida or Massachusetts to try to get readmitted, what F. Lee Bailey did was he tried to get admitted as a member of the Maine bar. He took the Maine bar exam, and he passed the Maine bar exam, but the Maine bar refused to allow his admission into the Maine bar because of the character evidence that came about as a result of his disbarment in Florida and Massachusetts. Even though significant time had passed, the Maine bar felt that Mr. Bailey was not remorseful enough. It didn't appear that he had learned from his misconduct about the wrongs that he had committed against his client and against the government. And for that reason, in 2014, the Maine bar refused his application for admission.
Being smart is without a doubt a great strength, but mix in a bit of overconfidence and arrogance, and it can quickly become a significant weakness. Exhibit A, F. Lee Bailey.